Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and as my guest host today, we have Care Charbear, Chairbear, Cars. And I can't hear her, so she may be muted again. Which, if that's the case, I really want to figure out how that keeps happening. Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. I don't know. No, she's not. If she's muted, it isn't on our end. That would be a miracle. So okay, we will.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, no, I think she's got to take care of her mic, or she can hit me up on Discord if there's an issue. But that actually genuinely, I don't think was our end. I will double check that, but I'm like 91% sure it's actually probably our fault. It doesn't seem to be on our end, so we'll let her get that sorted. So thank you all for joining us. Oh my God, we've got a great show planned for everybody today. Ozymandias and Dr. Carrier are here, as you can see. So thank you both for showing up. We both have been frequent guests of the show, and we just love having you guys. And I think this is the first time you guys have really streamed together. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's an interesting topic. It's one of my favorite topics: philosophy and religion together. So it's going to be marvelous. If you like the show, please don't hesitate to hit that thumbs up button, like and subscribe. That really it helps out the show. You can also become a patron. We do monthly patron hangouts. We just had our patron hangout yesterday. That was a lot of fun. Thank you all for those of you who joined us for that. And or you can become a member. We'll talk more about that, I think, a little bit after the show today. We're going to do the patron hangout, and everybody can meet us there. I think Dr. Carrier, you're going to be available for that. Ozzy's going to try and join us for that, and so we'll hopefully see some of you guys, and we can just continue the conversation on there. We also have today, if you're watching us on anything other than YouTube, we decided to simulcast that. You can just @In Time Show. Any questions you have, I will get those, and I can also put them up on the screen here. I'm going to be on 604 Atheist tomorrow, discussing my own deconversion, which is going to be a lot of fun. I think you guys all know who he is, and he's a lot of fun. So, looking forward to that. We're also going to have on Richard Reed, who did the Nick of Time, the little short on Richard Reed's a video on the most dangerous place to live, which for him, he said, was in the mind of a white man who hates him. And so we're going to have him on with Karis Crane to discuss systemic racism in the United States. We're also going to have Ozzy back with Kathleen to discuss the ontology of gender. We had hoped that would be on the 15th. We're probably going to have to push that back, but that's going to be a lot of fun too. I think On Writing will have its second episode on the 24th. What's Wrong with Religion will be September 29th. That show I'm looking forward to. That's going to be with a good friend of mine. He is actually a Greek Orthodox minister, and he himself has a lot of interesting critiques of religion, and especially Catholicism. So we're going to have him on to discuss his views. Generations Theory on the 30th, and on October 13th, we will be discussing World War III. What might that look like? Where do we have to look for it coming from? What to expect? World War III has been a trending hashtag at least 2 or 3 times this year. And so what would that really look like if it was something we had to worry about? So anyways, I think given that, what I'd like to do is introduce our two, and I'm getting a note from Karis, so I'm going to go see if I can get her into the show. But while we do that, I'd like to introduce our two guests, Dr. Carrier and Ozymandias Ramses. How are you two doing?
Doing good. Apart from, as I mentioned, back channel, my throat's a little bit sore from the ash and smoke covering California of late.
That's something, until you actually have lived in California, you don't realize, like, that's an actual legit problem. Like, you go there,
Yeah.
and it's just like, that happens at least 2 or 3 times a year.
With the record heat and the lightning storms. Hey, I hear audio.
Yeah.
Karis, nice to see you again.
You too, Richard.
Wow.
Despite my best efforts, Karis has managed to get the audio working on her thing. Yeah. I know. So you were saying, Richard, and you got a book that's either out, that's dropped already, or is going to be out soon too, which I want to hear about.
Very soon, if it hasn't already. I mean, you can pre-order it if it's not for sale, but it should be for sale like now, very, very soon, like within weeks. Jesus from Outer Space. Right? So this is my pop market, short market version of Historicity of Jesus, but it's quick 2 pages and distills the argument down to the very basics, and then just the essentials, and then walks the reader through a lot of the usual problems, the barriers for against accepting this idea that Jesus might have begun his existence as a revelatory being and only been turned into a historical figure later. This book basically gives you the breakdown as to why that makes sense in context when you look at it in the ancient world. And it's written colloquially. It doesn't have footnotes, it's only like pages. But it has some new stuff in it in terms of ways of framing the argument that will, I think, make more sense to people. If you read the academic monograph, which is on the historicity of Jesus, which is huge, tons of footnotes, 90 pages of apparatus, bibliographies and indexes and all that. If you read that, there's so much information there that you can and it's technically presented, so you might miss some of the points, I think, or they might not be clear. And so in Jesus from Outer Space, I really go to, these are the things that people are stopping points for people, and I walk through them in a very colloquial English way to try and make clear these things make sense in context. And then, and it really focuses on some arguments that I think are less important in the academic book, but are more important for a popular audience to grasp. I like it. I'm happy with the book, actually. So it came out very well. But yeah, that's available. You can get that. You can at least pre-order it on Amazon. If you go through my website, even better. And go to my website, richardcarrier.info, and one of the links at top is books or books, and you can go in there and find it. It'll be right at the top, and then link through there. That's what I say. That's the best way to buy it.
All right, so we have the link already to your website in the description. You have been cutting out a little bit, so I don't know if again the default is to blame the show, but in this case I'm actually like kind of reasonably sure it's not us. It's Karis will tell you it's us, but I really don't think it is in this case.
No, Richard, last time you were backlit and you looked like an angel. This time we just can't hear you.
Yeah.
I don't know what that could be. There shouldn't be any problem with that. I'll bring the machine closer to me, and hopefully that'll help with that problem.
Yeah.
Do you hear any background noise? Is there any other?
I don't. It almost sounds like and I'm just going to double check. There is actually a possibility, I suppose. I'm going to double check and see if on our end, like, there's a noise gate applied to your channel. I don't think so, but I will double check it. Also, somebody's been mentioning you going on Joe Rogan. So Chomsky Videos has been asking about you going on Joe Rogan and said that might be a good thing. So I am passing that up because apparently somebody's interested.
Well,
but
I would too, but Joe Rogan's manager would have to ask me, right? I just love how people assume you can just be on someone's show, right? It's like, you should be on Joe Rogan. It's like, yeah, I make that decision. I can just do that. Right? No, yeah. That's not how that works at all.
Yeah. So Ozzy, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? I have no.
That's an epidemic.
Now we can't hear Ozzy. No, we can't hear Ozzy. And again, I'm gonna claim
complete audio drop. There's no like scratchy or anything. It's just gone.
Yeah, and we heard him earlier, and I swear to God, I haven't changed a thing.
And normally I'm very quick to blame Nick, but I can't.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, dear Lord. Well, it's only because she knows me. Yeah. All right. Well, so this is my opportunity. So let me tell you about Ozzy. Real pain in the neck. I honestly don't know how anyone can put up with a guy for more than about 5 or 10. Ozzy, how are you? He's
I'm very
back.
well. Now?
Oh, yeah, well,
There we
yeah,
go.
we can hear you now.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure where, but anyway, dropping, coming back in seems to have fixed it. So what was the question? Tell me about myself. Let's see. I'm a YouTuber who lives in Canada, in Ontario, Canada. I make videos about the Great Debate, the intersection of religion and politics. My background is in academic philosophy. I was once an aspiring philosopher, although I don't have a doctorate. I left academia before completing my doctorate. I was interested specifically in epistemology, the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of language. My dissertation work was directed towards epistemology at the time when I left academia. And most of my time in the Great Debate online has been trying to sort of help out my fellow atheists in the Great Debate formulate better arguments, better counter-apologetics, sometimes avoiding the wrong kinds of counter-apologetics, helping them up their game with respect to epistemology and philosophy of language to avoid falling into certain kinds of traps from certain styles of apologetics, especially presuppositionalism, which was very much in vogue when I entered the conversation. That's about it for me. I've long wanted an opportunity to have a discussion on almost any subject with Dr. Richard Carrier. I'm a longtime fan of his work. I've been interested in mythicism for a long time, largely because of him and Dr. Robert Price. I've always been very sympathetic to it. I'm not a mythicist, but I am certainly an agnostic with respect to the question of the existence of Jesus as a historical figure. And so I'm very enthused to hear about this latest book because, as we were saying before we went on air, this book sounds like it's going to fill in a missing piece of the puzzle, which for me was critical in the argument. So I'm looking forward to reading that book.
All right. Well, marvelous. So we've been doing sort of an introduction to philosophy series on the channel, which Ozzy has been doing with us, and I think this actually sort of came about in part because we had Dr. Carrier on, and we were discussing Christianity's influence on science, and I think it was very interesting how sort of science, religion was an attempt at sort of one of our first attempts at science. So I guess I'd like to start by framing the topic and trying to figure out when we talk about the philosophy of religion, what is that going to encompass, and what is the goal of trying to discuss the philosophy of religion? And this is to either of you.
Well, what do you think?
I can feel this first, Kelly. Okay, well, I mean, I'll address this from the standpoint of someone who taught philosophy of religion in university. When I say I taught, I wasn't a professor. I was a graduate student, and I was charged with teaching a philosophy of religion course. I was also a teaching assistant to someone else who was teaching the course, as well as that. And of course, when you teach introductory classes on philosophy, you end up having a section almost invariably on what is the philosophy of religion. Because invariably in the introductory philosophy course, you end up dealing with the question of God's existence. And so you end up teaching things like, Aquinas' 5 ways, 5 proofs of God, and things like that, Anselm's ontological argument. So the philosophy of religion is that chapter of philosophy that concerns itself with theistic concerns or deistic concerns and atheistic concerns. Right? The ultimate question, I suppose, around which almost the whole field concerns itself is the existence of God and the nature of God, and or gods, not just the Abrahamic faiths, but other gods as well, and other conceptions of God, such as deism and pantheism and so forth. And so there are arguments for the existence of various kinds of gods, what their nature would be, what the nature of belief is, what the nature of faith is. So it's a kind of broad umbrella that captures everything about religion, but it's not religion itself. You are trying to apply all of the tools, at least within the analytic tradition of philosophy, you are trying to apply all the critical thinking tools that we have to bear in the history of philosophy and in science to understand the nature of religion, religiosity, God, gods, faith, belief, and all of that. So it's a
Yeah, I
metadiscipline.
would.
It's a discipline about religion. It's not religion itself. You can be completely irreligious, as I was and am, and be interested in the philosophy of religion.
Yeah, I would expand on that a little bit. I mean, the focus is often on gods and the God part of it, but philosophy of religion can be even broader than that. It's just, what is religion? Why does it matter? And religions come with worldviews. They're not just, there is a God. There's like a whole cosmology and a metaphysics, even an epistemology. Like there's a lot of aspects that tie into all other aspects of philosophy as well. And so philosophy of religion can be a focus on how do we approach these issues from the perspective of religion, and should we even? And that can be like Ozzy said, it can be not from a pro-religious perspective, but even like, religion is a thing in the world, and religious worldviews are in people's minds and affecting their decisions and beliefs and stuff. So analyzing them and understanding those things is important. It's kind of like doing the philosophy of fiction or something like that. It's an important thing in the world that you can actually study, regardless. You don't have to believe the things that you're studying, but you can study it and try to understand it, how those things came about, and also how they affected the course of history. I think one of the things that led to this, our getting together to do this show, was a comment I made before about how religions were the original attempt to explain the world and the cosmos and humanity and all of this stuff. And then the big change that occurred starts with the pre-Socratics in ancient Greece, where they started not doing that. They started trying to explain everything through mechanisms in nature, and sort of demystifying, getting rid of the supernatural, basically. And that was kind of a very strange development in history. You don't see it very often. And then it became a huge cultural touchstone. It became like a mainstream thing in Greek culture, and in a way that it didn't happen, for example, in ancient China. We have some examples of naturalism being attempted in ancient China, but they're fringe. They didn't catch on. They didn't become popular. And one of the biggest examples is Wang Chung, the Han Dynasty philosopher, Confucian philosopher. He wrote the Lun Heng, which is this big book about Confucian philosophy, a bunch of essays, basically, but entirely from a naturalist perspective, where he's trying to explain even like ghost phenomenon and like skeptical terms, and like all in terms of natural phenomenon, getting rid of the supernatural. But that didn't become a touchstone in Chinese intellectual culture, and it existed, but it didn't go anywhere. Whereas in ancient Greece, the pre-Socratic movement really took over the intellectual elite and became kind of the mainstream intellectual position for 1,000 years. Basically 1,000 years. And then of course, by the end of that 1,000 years, Christianity is running the world, and now we're back to a supernaturalist worldview. And it's not that there weren't supernaturalists among the intellectual elite, but they had a much more rationalistic way of trying to conceive of it. And then there were a lot of like hardcore naturalists as well, and that was fine. But I teach an online course on ancientism to this, like where were atheists hiding in the ancient world, and in plain view mostly. They were very Confucian in their construction of religion. Like they were fine with naturalistic explanations of religion, and they were fine with letting the public believe the things that they believed, but the elites had their own sort of rationalized version of that, and so they could still believe in gods, but they had it's much more like the scientists of the scientific revolution were generally all Christian believers, might have had unorthodox or weird views of the supernatural, but still sought to explain everything in naturalistic terms, tried to de-supernaturalize the universe anyway. And so the ancient Greeks and Romans were doing the same thing, and that's our Western culture. That's how we ended up where we are today, is because they started that and got the fire lit, and then eventually we abandoned it for 1,000 years and got back to it, and that's a whole other story. But that's why I think that was the significant thing, is like this development in their philosophy of religion, which is to reconceptualize religion in naturalistic terms, and there was a lot of that going on in the ancient world.
So a loaded question and ancillary topic, I suppose. So if we started with if science, philosophy, and religion sort of all started roughly the same place, how has if at all, how has religion changed? Where's religion now? What role does it fill in our lives, and how has it changed from say 2 or 3,000 years ago to today?
Yeah, I
Well,
mean
that's
the
a question I
secularization
would like Richard.
theory.
That's what.
What's that?
So I
No, I
think
was
there's
just saying.
a bit of a lag. Sorry, Ozzy,
Sorry,
you were saying?
I'm sorry. I was just saying that's a deeply historical question that I would let Richard answer. I'm not qualified
Oh,
on the history of change of in the
yeah.
philosophy of religion.
Well, the biggest change is the secularization of the world, right? So from the Enlightenment to now, religion has become less and less, less and less important. It's not that it's become unimportant. We still have religious fundamentalists trying to run even first world countries. But the religion used to crawl into every aspect of our lives. Like there was just nowhere to go where there wasn't religion somehow being involved in what you were doing. Whereas now religion is kind of being parked on the side. Like you go there Sunday, maybe not even that, right? Like go to church maybe on a Sunday. Most of your life. Well, I mean, actually, it's a good point. We could talk about like places in like Searcy, Arkansas, which but that's a good example. Let me use that example. So Searcy, Arkansas is where I can't remember which church controls it. It's there's a big college there. It's Harding, I think, or something like that, and it's Church of God or Church of Christ. I can't remember what one of those, but they're one of the ones that are against alcohol. So they have everyone who attends the college or works at the college. So whether you're teaching there, whether you're a janitor there, whether you're a student there, you have to sign a contract swearing that you will not drink even in your private life, right? So, and then the college and their church's influence got laws passed that turned it into a dry city. So no one could drink anywhere in the town. Now, the interesting thing is that's gradually falling apart now. Because they're losing control because they don't control everything anymore. And it was funny. There was a loophole. They had a loophole long ago in the law that allowed police unions or police clubs of police officers could have a private club where they could drink. And that was the only. But they couldn't write the law so that it was only police could do it. They just had they wrote it in a certain way that only the police could take advantage of it. Well, the restaurants figured out that the wording of the law allows them to do this. They just have to serve to members. So when you come in, they say, do you want to be a member? And they just make you a member. And now they can serve you beer and wine, right? And so and there's no way around this. And so the church tried to get this law fixed to like really kill alcohol. They lost. They didn't succeed. So they're losing control, right? And this is a really, Searcy, this story is anachronistic now. Like most of the country is not like that, right? Like they're like the dinosaurs of American cities. Most of the country is moving on from this, or already has moved on from this. And there are still isolated places that are still backwards. They're still like 50 years behind the times. But even those you see are gradually falling apart. Like the control of religion on every aspect is disintegrating and shrinking. So like the number of people who allow that to be the case in their lives is shrinking, the percentages of the population. And so you have that situation where religion is less powerful and less integrated in our lives. And we're getting more and more secular. We're engaging in more social activities that don't have anything to do with religion. Holidays are becoming less religion-oriented and so on. And it's not that the religion doesn't exist and isn't still pushing, the whole Christmas narrative thing. Every once in a while there's the war on Christmas gets floated on Fox News and whatnot. And it's ridiculous to call it a war on Christmas. It's just the culture is changing. Like we like Santa Claus and elves, and we know it's fiction. We don't really care about the nativity stuff. More and more Americans, more and more Westerners are turning to the secular version of Christmas, and that's just happening. And there's, they're angry about it, and so they rail against it, call it a war on Christmas, and try to kick some dust up, but they're losing ultimately. Gradually, they're just losing. It's just going to be secularized, and that's just what's happening. It just takes time. It's slow, but that's the biggest change in history that had not previously been the case. Previously, religion kind of consumed every aspect of life, even your entire understanding of the world, politics, like everything. Religion was just everything. It would be weird to even try to distinguish religion from anything else. And some theorizers, they had philosophy of religion in ancient Greece and Rome. Some theorizers tried it, but it was tricky to do because religion just has its claws everywhere.
So there are people who say, I'll use Andrew Yang for an example. I don't think that's quite extreme enough, but I think there are people who say that there's almost this religious fervor to how people follow Andrew Yang and or Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Now, I don't, to the best of my knowledge, there's no hard and fast definition of religion. But how do we really know when something is religious? What are we talking about when we're talking religion?
That's a good question, because you hit on something that I've been writing about on my blog occasionally, is that political ideologies are the new religions. Everything religion used to do is now tied to a largely secular political ideology. Well, yeah, but I mean, they have all the same things. There's like the libertarians and the progressives, and you pick, boogaloos. You could pick any weird political or mainstream political movement. They have their own mythology. They have their own dogmas. They have their own kind of faith-based epistemology. All of the things that people used to do when they would become a fundamentalist, they're now doing attached to some conspiracy theory or to some political movement or whatever. In fact, it's almost impossible to tell the difference. The only thing that I see is the difference when we colloquially talk about religion. What we usually always mean is something to do with the supernatural. And that's the only thing that's changed. I think if you take the supernatural out of religion, what you have left is a political ideology, a worldview.
Or Hinduism.
And what's that? What was that, Karis?
Or Hinduism.
Or Hinduism?
Or you have
Yeah. Even Buddhism has a supernatural. Like even Taoism has a supernatural. So
I think I was thinking Buddhism. I'm getting my isms mixed up today.
Yeah, but even Buddhism has the supernatural, has a lot of the supernatural tied into it. And if you try to completely remove the supernatural out of Buddhism, all you end up is just another atheist philosophy, right? So you've got another worldview that will affect every part of your life, your politics, your epistemology, your ethics. So it's just, that's I think the thing, at that point it's just a philosophy or a worldview or an ideology. But when you call it a religion, it's usually something that...
Sorry.
Oh, it's fine. It's usually something that's tied into the supernatural.
Yes.
Sorry, our lag is problematic. All right, I'm going to be quiet so you can speak.
By all means, speak. It means I speak less, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. She's blaming me too for her ism confusion, and I just got a DM from her. She's like, "It's my fault for the ism confusion. It's my fault for the lie." I just, you know what? It's just.
Oh, you'll get one now.
So, Karis, ask your question, and I want to let Dr. Carrier finish, and then I want to ask Ozzy the same question and actually springboard that, because I think science may also have some. You mentioned religious epistemology, and I want to get into that. But so, Karis, what was your question?
Well, I had two of them, but they're not exactly related, and they really have little to do with each other, probably. My first had been, how do you think the advancement of science affects the relationship between culture and religion now versus how it did way back when? And my next question was, you had mentioned mythologies within the context of politics, and I was wondering if you could expound on some of that and how that might contrast with mythologies within religion.
Oh, yeah. Good questions. The first one, a good way to make that clear is in the ancient world, and I write about this in my book. I have a book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. And then I have a companion volume, it's Science Education in the Early Roman Empire.
I was hoping you would take that in both.
In both I talk about this. There is this tension between the educated elite, the literate elite, and their conception of trying to naturalize everything, turn everything into a natural mechanism. Even the gods become hardly very different from extraterrestrials in their system of thinking. And the public that hates this, that thinks that this is very atheistic and impious. The public is very superstitious, very invested in the supernatural. And these elites will sometimes talk about how it really pisses off the public when you start saying that Poseidon doesn't control the weather, right? That Poseidon is just a metaphor for well, they actually talked about it in terms of pressure systems, heat and pressure systems, the actually correct understanding of climate. They actually had some good theories as to how rain and storms work. And they weren't fully sketched out, but they were at least thinking in terms of natural phenomenon, heat and so on, and of evaporation and stuff like that. So they actually had these naturalistic explanations, and they would say, well, Poseidon's just a metaphor for all of that. And then they say, but don't say that to like your local farmer or whatever. Like they'll get really upset. It's that kind of thing, where they're really invested in the supernatural. And I think science back then was very much the province of the elite, the illiterate elite. There's some science filtered down into the public, but only a little. And that's what I talk about in science education in the early Roman Empire, or even talk about pop culture. Like how does scientific knowledge disseminate to the illiterate masses in that kind of context, and what kind of knowledge did? And that's what I talk about in that. But now we have universal literacy. We teach science courses at all grade levels. So people have a much more scientific worldview than they used to do. And so that we're not, we don't have that rampant superstition. The supernatural has been shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And so there's fewer and fewer people who believe in a lot of it. And then more and more people believe in less and less of it. So we're less involved in demons.
Comets, meteors.
Yeah, like demons don't cause my car to break. You can find people in the U.S. that think that, but they're very fringe, right? That's not the normal.
A lot of.
Yeah, right. Well, no, I'd say most people now understand that we'll come up with a natural explanation or a scientific explanation, and the role of demons has been relegated to certain isolated scenarios. Usually, in the traditional sense, people that don't conform must be possessed by demons or something. It's the more extreme. Yeah, right. Yeah, the more extreme fundamentalists are still attached to the supernatural in more ways. But even they are not as attached to it as their counterparts 1,000 years ago were, which were, like the supernatural system.
Well, so
that's one thing that's changed. But the other question, what was your second question? That was important.
Well, and I want to make sure, because I want to get Ozzy's take on it too. So there's a couple. There was one on how do we identify a religion. I think there is a difference between sort of religious behavior and a religion.
Yeah.
And then the epistemology of.
Her other question hits right on that point then, which is what's the difference between a secular mythology and a religious mythology? Now let's give you an example. There's this conservative. I read this conservative article someone was ranting about governments just waste money. There's no point. We should defund government and so on. And they had this elaborate example about how this government grant funded the planting of grass in the median and a highway, and they just planted it and they didn't put any provision to water it, and it just shriveled up and died, and it was just a waste of money. Completely false story. This never happened, but he believes it happened. And it's important to him to believe that it happened, because his ideology is built on this mythology, this myth of how the government spends money justifies his beliefs about what he should do with government. So his political ideology is built on this foundation of mythology. There's tons of myths like these. There's tons and tons of them. They have all of stories they can tell about how money got wasted, or how the welfare queen is a classic example. Like this whole mythology of how welfare works, and they're based on stories people will tell each other that are false largely or hugely inaccurate. But the way they're made false justifies the ideology, and so the ideologies are. And I have to say, liberals do this too. Liberals have their own fictional stories, their own mythologies that when they believe these things, they don't really fact check them. And so, but as conservatives do it more, I think, is my finding. But it's the mythologies are always there. You can find it in any political ideology. There'll be these false stories about reality that people believe are true that justify their political ideology. And that's exactly what myth does. But the difference is that there's two different things today. Religious mythologies are based on the supernatural. So usually we're talking about myth, we're talking about magic, miracles, that kind of thing. But in antiquity, the one thing that myths did was that they were allegorical. They were a form of language to talk about social structure and social expectations. And we don't really use mythology that way anymore. We use mythology more as you have to believe in it to justify your beliefs. And I think this is kind of a secularization of fundamentalism, where belief that we have to believe the Bible is literally true. We can't believe that it's an allegory for something else. That idea has seeped over into secular ideologies as well. We have to believe the myths are true. The myths have to be true. It's no longer the myths could just be allegories for something in some deeper understanding. Now, we've done that with fiction, right? So we have movies, books, novels, where we fully accept that these can be metaphors and analogies for things, and we don't have to believe that they're true to benefit from them, to learn from them. So we've kind of replaced ancient mythology with fiction now. Whereas what we've done is we've gone fundamentalist with our mythology, and it has to be literally factually true, even when it's secular mythologies for libertarians, for progressives, and so on. So that's my take on that.
That's an excellent point, and I think that's a really good observation, and politically too. So, Ozzy, what's your take on all this?
Well, with respect to sort of what a religion is, that's necessarily going to be a gray thing, and I actually agree that where religion and political ideology are to be distinguished is going to be almost impossible to work out. And that's because in religion and in politics, you have an anthropology. That is, you have a theory of human nature. You have a theory about what humans are. You have a theory about the world. You have a theory about humans' place in the world, their role, what they ought to do. It carries with it an aesthetic. It carries with it an ethic. It carries with it a whole theory, a whole worldview about what you can know and what you should strive to know, what it is within your grasp to try to accomplish, and what you must not try to accomplish. Right? Politics extends its concerns over everything that religion used to concern itself with, minus the supernatural. You can now do politics without the supernatural, and as Richard said correctly before, I mean, in the ancient world, these things were all mixed up together. So when you try to do sort of a history of political thinking in the ancient world, it's going to line up with the history of religious thinking in the ancient world, because they were coextensive. They were essentially the same thing. Today, we are able to extract politics simply by extracting the supernatural component of a person's worldview. So you can be a secular Christian. But you don't have to be. You can be a supernaturalist Christian to whatever degree you happen to think is the case. So there's no clear boundaries when it comes to the philosophy of religion. In fact, now, at least within the analytic tradition, when we talk about the philosophy of religion, we really are talking about God beliefs. It's not strictly, polytheistic gods and monotheistic gods. As I said before, it could include deism and things like that. But it can also include things like animism and stuff like that, right? So, but we got to be careful, because the philosophy of religion is not the same thing as the sociology of religion. It's not the same thing as just doing anthropology, right? So I think that the philosophy of religion doesn't concern itself so much with the sociology of religion and trying to hammer out what a definition of religion and religiosity is. I mean, it seems curious to say that. The philosophers are not particularly concerned with that. But in my experience, people who are interested in philosophy of religion are not especially concerned with how to define religion and religiosity. They are concerned with certain specific questions. Does a God exist? What is a God? If a God exists, what could it be? What would it imply if such and such a thing existed? Is religiosity good for society? So there are ethical and moral questions about religions. What are the functional roles that religions and religiosity serve in a society, and what goods does it provide psychologically to an individual? So philosophers of religion will be concerned with specific questions that have to do with religion and religiosity, but they're not particularly concerned, in my experience, with trying to hammer out and agree on a definition of religion and religiosity. That's not been my experience of what goes on in the philosophy of religion. And it's
Yeah,
not
I
uncommon
think
for philosophers.
in practice, that's what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. And in my experience also, when philosophers talk about religion nowadays, it's almost said, the word religion is almost used disparagingly. And that's true culturally too. When people say that a certain political ideology has a religious character, right? For instance, I'm a person who's very much of the left. Nevertheless, there are certain things going on in so-called woke culture that I find rather alarming and distressing. And what I find alarming and distressing about it is a certain kind of irrationality and dogmatic adherence to a lot of unfalsifiable claims. Uh, and uh, and to the extent that a political ideology is rife with dogmatism and is resistant to empirical considerations, then it seems to mirror a lot of what we see in certain kinds of religions. Not all religions are dogmatic. Some are more dogmatic than others. But I think at the heart of everything that we would nowadays call a religion is an adherence to certain doctrines that are held not necessarily um, um, uh, in the very teeth of evidence, but certainly in the absence of evidence. And so I'll often hear philosophers of religion talking about the religiosity or the religious aspects of certain political ideologies. And that's because these things just completely overlap. If you have a worldview, you're going to have certain metaphysical commitments, right? Those metaphysical commitments are going to tell you about the nature of the world. They're going to tell you something about the nature of humans. They're going to tell you about what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what can be known, what can't be known. So you get this whole worldview. No matter what your worldview is, it is a total picture. The extent to which it contains supernatural elements, I think, is going to dictate whether or not you're going to call that a religion, or whether that's a religious outlook or not. And I don't think there's anything more to it than that. It really is a kind of family resemblance issue nowadays.
Yeah, that's my take on it as well.
So, it sounds like to try to distill it down. And we had a couple questions pertaining to this. So let me see if I can sort of merge it into one here. That religion is basically an adherence to either an irrational ideology or an ideology that at a minimum cannot be is not presently supported by evidence. And I'm not sure that necessarily. So, what I was going to suggest is that necessarily, is that a sufficient condition? Is that just a necessary condition? The reason I ask is because the last time you were here, Ozzy, we did a show on Hume's problem of induction. And one of the things about that is for those who aren't familiar with it, what it suggests is that really there's no rational, you cannot rationally justify using induction, which is the cornerstone of all science. So we do science, but we do it based on assumptions that we can't actually rationally justify. So would that mean that even something like science now is falling into the realm of religion, or is that somehow exempt? And if so, how could you exempt it without special pleading? So I'd like to get Ozzy's take on this, and then I'd like to get Dr. Carrier on it.
Well, my own view is that every metaphysical view, every person's worldview, includes metaphysical assumptions, some of which cannot be justified or even vindicated after the fact, after you've made the assumptions and operate on it. But the fact that every worldview is going to have some faith-based commitments at the heart of it, I don't think makes it religious. As I said, I think what makes it religious is having certain kinds of faith-based commitments. It's not that religions have to be, inherently they have to be more irrational or dogmatic or indefensible. No, that's not. I don't think that's the case. There are secular positions that can be completely irrational, just divorced from reality and empirical considerations, not even born of looking at the world, and they don't have to involve any supernatural elements, right? And I would say that those are dogmatic worldviews. They wouldn't be religious worldviews. On my own assessment of how we now think about religion. So I don't think it's particularly productive to use a definition of religion that associates it with irrationality intrinsically. That just seems to me to be prejudicial. It's excessively evaluative.
Yeah, I agree. It's neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition. It may be a contingent fact that all religions are irrational, but that's not by definition. That would just be a happenstance of how things turned out. Because I write about this a lot. Like in my blog, I have several instances where I talk about supernatural versus the natural. The supernatural could have been real, right? Like there actually could be gods that maybe they live on Mars, maybe we can visit them, right? Like it's that it could have turned out that way, right? And so analytically,
we're a sim, and our God is some kid playing the simulation.
Well, yeah, analytically, I wouldn't call that supernatural, but that's a whole other issue of how we're going to define the supernatural. But it does butt up against Arthur C. Clarke's third law, right? Any technology suitably advanced is indistinguishable from magic. But the idea is that I wouldn't say that religion is by definition irrational, because if you analytically study it, you might find out that it's completely rational, or that there is a completely rational religion. You don't know that in advance. You can't know that a priori. You can find that out. You can go test religions and see if any of them are irrational. So religion can't be defined in terms of rationality or irrationality. I think it can only be defined, well, if we look at the way the word is used colloquially, the way it's used generally, even in academia, conventional usage seems to always link it to the supernatural. If it doesn't have the supernatural, it tends not to call it religion. And I think that's just linguistic convention. That's just the way the word is being used. So I think that if we're going to talk about religion in a way that that's relevant, that pertains to the way the word gets used and what people think the word means in public, we need to be talking about supernatural things. And I think the biggest focus now is gods. And Ozzy was talking about, like, most of what they focus on now is God talk. But I think illustrates something I said earlier, that religion is shrinking. Like it used to be, like we'd be talking about witchcraft, or we'd be talking about like angels and demons and angelology and demonology and like all this other stuff. We're like, no, we've kind of like ditched all that. We've shrunk the realm of the supernatural to now it's just some nebulously defined God something or other that lives in another dimension or something. It's not even located in space. So like we're really, really shrinking the realm of what's considered worth talking about. And even the fundamentalists that believe in angels and demons and stuff like that, like philosophers of religion, they've passed that. Like they're not even going to spend time talking about that. They only see the God concept as the only thing respectable enough to even bother with, generally. But that's just another sign of what I'm talking about, is how religion is shrinking in terms of what people take seriously and how much it's involved. And now it's just shrunk down to just the core of gods, or God, really. So most of it is talking about God, not even gods. Like polytheism rarely comes up in a philosophy of religion now. And I think that's another symptom of what I was talking about before, of the shrinking role of religion in life.
So, and you're muted.
Ozzy, you're muted.
Ozzy? Nope.
Oh, damn.
This is okay. He may need to refresh, and so
Okay.
I did have a question for him, but what I can do is I can go to you, because there was a question in the live chat that I thought was interesting, and just apropos of what you've been discussing earlier, and someone said this may be a distinction without a difference. I imagine when you get into the minutia, it probably does become important. But somebody had suggested that, well, instead of having having politics or political ideologies as a subset of religion isn't in fact, aren't they both isms, and there's each sort of a subset of isms?
Yeah, absolutely. They're both ideologies. They're both worldviews, really. And so the thing that distinguishes the religious worldview from a non-religious worldview is what we've been talking about. I think if you start throwing supernatural things into the worldview, we start to call it a religion. And I think that's just the colloquial way and even the academic way that we've been using the word. I don't think words don't have necessary meanings. It's just whatever happenstance, the way the words are getting used, whatever the convention is, that's become the convention. It's religion. Generally, when we speak religion, we're talking about supernaturalist worldviews versus non-supernaturalist worldviews. But if you take that one thing out, then there's not much left that's different. Right, between a religious worldview and a political ideology. So
I'm going to regret bringing this up, and I actually have two questions for Ozzy when he comes back. He can probably hear us, but I'm going to regret bringing this up. But you had asked earlier. We were talking about how you and I met, and we actually you had been doing a show which Karis had been hosting. But the other thing that had happened was it's just because you brought it up about words having meanings. The biggie, which you may or may not remember, was you and Mr. Steve McCrae had gotten into a discussion, and you got into an argument. And I actually wrote an essay that was trying to, and I don't know if you remember that. That was a while back, and there was a little talking past each other. But I remember most about that was he said, "You see, Richard, Nick agrees with me." And you're like, "No, he agrees with me." I was like, "Okay, that's it." I'm speaking of words and their meanings. I was like, "Okay, my paper is okay." Which I just think I thought you were both right. You were just, but at any rate, I just thought that was funny because it was about the words and the meaning of words. So Ozzy's back. So Ozzy, I had a couple of questions. I do want to get into what do we mean when we say theism, because I use it in a much more classical sense. I think it's used very differently nowadays. But so when I talk about theism, nine times out of 10, I'm talking monotheistic religions. And what's interesting is that's actually how, oh my God, what's his name? Like one of the most famous atheists ever. He was a journalist. Died recently.
Christopher Hitchens.
Hitchens, thank you. Hitchens used the classic version. So my brain is just. But at any rate, but before we get on to that, it's just like a whole. I'm just writing down questions as we're going through. So you had said The Five Ways by Thomas Aquinas, which is Quince Vitae. I can never pronounce it. I just because I want to be a snob, I want to learn how to pronounce it. Pronounce the Latin. So one of you will have to teach me how to do that. But that's an apologetics argument. And it's one that I still hear it actually all the time in one way or another. And people say, "No, this isn't Aquinas." Yes, it's Aquinas. It's the exact same. It's Aquinas. That's been so. Is the study of philosophy of religion, is it a kind of apologetics? Is it a counter to what is it in relation to the actual religion itself?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because this is the confusion that I encounter the most in the atheist community when the expression philosophy of religion is raised. If I mention something, well, you should learn something about the philosophy of religion if you're going to participate in this debate, right? Immediately, people think that you're talking about apologetics and that it's your job to study apologetics. Now, if you're going to go around being a counter-apologist, if you're going to go around arguing for the non-existence of God and arguing that all apologetical arguments are bunk, you better learn some apologetics. You better learn what you're talking about. You need to know what you're debunking. But nevertheless, philosophy of religion is not the same thing as apologetics. But it would include apologetics. But you can be a philosopher of religion and engage in no apologetics. I taught philosophy of religion, but I never taught apologetics. That is, I was not practicing apologetics. I was not arguing for the existence of God. That would not have been my place. I wasn't teaching in a seminary, for instance. This was at a university. But I had to teach certain classical apologetical arguments. So I had to give, Aquinas' 5 ways, the first cause argument, cosmological arguments, things like that. And theodicies of Leibniz and stuff like that. So I presented apologetical arguments as a way of helping people to understand how people made sense of their God concepts throughout history and how people to this day use those arguments. So in the course of learning something about philosophy of religion, you're going to pick up some apologetics along the way. But that's not to say that one is the same thing as the other. And there's lots of people who are interested in the philosophy of religion who just don't concern themselves with apologetics. There are some people that are just concerned, for instance, with the question, is the world a creation? Is the world an artifact? Right? Is this just a natural world that has always existed according to some kind of naturalistic laws? For instance, that would be one worldview, one kind of mechanistic, naturalistic worldview of an eternally existing physical system, devoid of any mind or intentions or purposes or anything like that. Or is the universe an artifact? right?
Mhm.
Now, they can be interested in that question and explore that question and ask themselves how they would identify that without having to get into apologetical arguments like the teleological argument or the first cause argument or anything like that. You can just explore the question purely out of philosophical curiosity. Just want to understand something about the nature of reality, or I just want to explore certain concepts for their own sake, because that's actually a good and useful exercise to work out the deductive implications of a certain concept. So you do not have to be committed to theism to practice the philosophy of religion or be interested in the philosophy of religion. You don't have to even devote an awful lot of attention to apologetics, although what typically brings people to an interest in the philosophy of religion is they rub up against some apologetical arguments, or they rub up against objections to apologetical arguments that they have advanced themselves, and that's how they get into the philosophy of religion. But they're not the same thing. And some people have a real disdain for apologetics. They think that all apologetics is ultimately an attempt to create a veneer of intellectual respectability for ancient dogmas. And I have to say, that's pretty much how I see apologetics myself. Nevertheless, philosophy of religion is more than that. It isn't just that. And so you don't have to be an apologist or be interested specifically in apologetics to be interested in philosophy of religion. And you brought up the question of theism and classical
Yes.
theism. Theism is a funny word. So if you talk to the average person who's interested in atheism online, they think that theism means any and all gods. And that is one usage of the word theism. But within the philosophy of religion, theism is very often defined more narrowly than that. For instance, deists are not theists. Deists don't consider themselves to be theists. They believe in a god, right? They think that there is a rational way by looking at the world empirically, just out of empirical considerations, you can arrive, you can infer through something like abduction, right? Inference is the best explanation, that the world is an artifact and was created by a god. Okay, there's no ancient doctrines or dogmas or anything like that. It doesn't imply an ethic or anything like that. It's not necessarily a whole metaphysical worldview. But deists don't think of themselves as theists, because deism is a view of the world as a creation that arose over and against traditional theistic concepts of gods, of the sort that we find in the Abrahamic faiths. So one way of defining theism is a theist is anyone who believes in any god at all, whether it's a god of the Abrahamic faith, one of the monotheisms, or a polytheistic religion, or any religion, including deism. But within the philosophy of religion, people, when they talk about theism, are usually talking about a god that is a person, that has a mind, that created the world and us in the world, and has certain purposes for us and certain intentions. It's a certain kind of God, right? It's a certain kind of being. And they would usually include polytheistic gods in there. But they recognize that deism and pantheism, these are non-theistic gods, which is kind of odd, because in the atheist community, for instance, theism and talk of gods go hand in hand. They're the same thing. It doesn't make sense to say that I'm a deist and not a theist. They think deism has to be subsumed under theism. But in the philosophy of religion, that's not so. In fact, there are some very liberal Christian theologians. I'm thinking of someone like John Shelby Spong, who is a Christian, who says he believes in God, but he does not believe in a theistic God. He thinks a theistic God is just this personification made large. It's just a human person writ large, right? It's just an anthropomorphization of whatever God really is. So someone like John Shelby Spong believes in a God, is a Christian, but his God doesn't bear much resemblance to what most other people would think of as the Christian God, because he has a non-theistic, a more deistic conception of God.
Well, Dr. Carrier, if you have anything you wanted to add to that, I'd love to hear your take on that. I also wanted to ask you a question well, there's a question for both of you. I'm going to give a smarmy answer. If anyone wants to amend that, please do. But there was the first question: what would Ozzy and Richard Carrier say to a person who claims that philosophy of religion is pseudoscience? I'd say I wish it were that high. I wish you could elevate it. It's not science. It's not. It's not. It's philosophy. It's not. But philosophy of religion as pseudoscience is like I don't even think it gets up to that point. But and then.
I saw that come up. I was gonna say something about it.
Okay, please.
So I have an article. Well, it's a video. There's a video video talk that I did. But you can also find a partial transcript of it called "Is Philosophy Stupid?" So if you just Google Richard Carrier and in quote marks "Is philosophy stupid?" you'll find these materials. And what I do is I quote a lot of these like major thinkers, scientists often, Stephen Hawking and various others, basically ragging on philosophy, saying that calling philosophy pseudoscience, essentially. Like maybe not literally, but practically. And then of course they always say this in books that are almost entirely works of philosophy. So they don't even know what they're talking about. But anyway, so I have this whole talk about some of this critique of philosophy is valid. There's a lot of garbage in philosophy. But a lot of this critique is not valid, and there is serious philosophy. And what I do is I go through the history of how philosophy came separated from science. Science actually is philosophy, and was in the ancient world. Like science was not distinct from philosophy. All science was what we would call science in the ancient world. They didn't have a distinctive word for it, but what we would call it is science with better data. It's philosophy with better data. Science is philosophy with better data. Philosophy is science with less data. Now, a lot of philosophy is like semantics and not data related, but so is a lot of science. So that's not the distinction. Philosophers are often trying to make claims about the nature of the world, the nature of how knowledge can be acquired. They're making tons of fact claims. They're not just doing analysis. And those fact claims, once you get enough data that you can really answer those claims, it becomes a science. Right, so you had philosophy of mind. Now we have cognitive science. Philosophy of mind still exists, but it only deals with the things that the science can't get at yet. Right, so like as you get more data, as you actually be able to reach the point where you can turn something into a science, it becomes a science and leaves philosophy. And philosophy just sticks around to deal with the stuff that's still left over that we can't get science at. And so if you look at it that way, philosophy of religion only becomes pseudoscience when you treat it like a science. So like if you're a fundamentalist and you think you can use philosophy of religion to prove that it is a fact that God exists, you are doing pseudoscience, basically, at that point. Whereas atheists aren't doing the same thing, because atheists are saying, look, there's no evidence for it. And all the evidence we do have is against it. That's not a pseudoscientific statement. It might be a philosophical statement. And I think in some cases you can really conclusively scientifically disprove things, like the Genesis theory of creation is scientifically disproved. That's conclusively done at this point empirically. But you can keep retreating and inventing more elaborate excuse-laden versions of creation that align with scientific evidence. But when you're doing that, you're not doing science anymore. You're doing philosophy at that point. You don't have the data to prove that your version of what's going on is true. If you did, you'd publish in a cosmology journal, a peer-reviewed cosmology journal, right? But they're not doing that, right? These theistic cosmology has almost no scientific explanatory value. Like you just can't meet the standards of science with that. Now you could have, if there was a God and there was evidence, you could have a working cosmological theistic theory in a cosmology journal like that. That would be entirely possible. It just, the evidence doesn't pan out that way. It's just, it's a contingent fact of what we've discovered, which is why we're all atheists here. But it didn't have to turn out that way. Analytically, it didn't have to. It could have gone the other way. Analytically, God could be a scientific subject. We could have, demonic possession curing wings and limb amputation healing wings in hospitals. We could have a whole science of miraculism. Thaumaturgy could be an actual scientific field. It's just not, because these things don't exist, or we haven't found them. We don't live in Harry Potter's world, where we can have an entire school, an entire science based around. Yes, well, I have an article also on defining the supernatural, where I use that as an example. I compare Harry Potter and Forbidden Planet. Do you know the sci-fi
Yeah.
movie Forbidden Planet, where there's actual technology inside the planet that allows things that seem supernatural to occur. So you could create the entire world of Harry Potter with one of those machines, but that would be different from magic. That would be it would be a hidden machine is causing it. It would be Oz or Wizard of Oz going on rather than. But the effects would be the same. You could still have all the spells and all the magic, and it would all work the same way. But that's the difference that I say between technology and the supernatural. The supernatural doesn't need the machine. The supernatural would just work. But if you need the machine, you're not talking about supernatural anymore. You're talking about technology.
Dr. Carrier, is there any topic that you haven't written an essay on? Because I've just not, every time we talk, so like I've
been doing this a long time. So
whatever it is, I wrote something on that. Okay.
Yeah, as a philosopher, I am a total. I don't believe in being hyper specialized. I think as a philosopher, you should explore all avenues that matter. All different areas of philosophy should be something that you're interested in. Consequently, so my interest in naturalism and my interest in the history of science and things like that end up putting me into discussing and researching many conceivable subjects. So yeah, we could probably come up with one I haven't written an essay on, but I've written on a lot of this stuff because it comes up and it's important. And I've been doing this so long that I've probably written something on something that matters at some point in my literary career.
May I pick up on a point that Richard brought up about the origin of scientific questions in philosophy? Because this is something that I've mentioned many times. It gets brought up by practically anyone who has an interest in this, but it is sort of subject to a certain objection that I think is actually a good objection so far as it goes, and that is that there's a kind of genetic fallacy at work. Yes, scientific questions that we now address and resolve now used to be asked by philosophers back in the day. It used to be called philosophy or natural philosophy. But to suggest that science today is still philosophy is this is a mistake. This is an instance of the genetic fallacy.
I disagree. I very much disagree.
You'll definitely want to see.
You want to see my article? I actually walk through the history of this. I actually have historical information showing that we only started semantically acting differently in the early 20th century. Before that, there wasn't any semantic difference between philosophy and science. So this whole scientific revolution was over and done with, and still science and philosophy were coterminous. In fact, the most famous and oldest scientific peer-reviewed journal is a journal of philosophy. It's in the title. If the Royal Society, right? Their journal is a journal of philosophy, and still it's called so-called. And that's an artifact from the semantics of the original period. The only difference that we make is when we start calling something science. The only difference is that we've got shit tons of data now. Like, that's it. It's the same thing the philosophers are doing. They're formulating hypotheses. They're doing analysis. All of the deductive aspects of science, when you start to make predictions from a hypothesis, that's exactly what philosophers are doing. The only difference is that scientists actually get access to the data, and the things they don't get access to, or the data is unclear or ambiguous. We don't have scientific controls around it. Then you find that stuff still being discussed among philosophers. So you see the qualia problem is still being discussed among philosophers. But neuroscience is no longer, theories of the brain are no longer part of at least very little, except when they try to deal with the qualia problem. But it's just a phenomenon. Once you get philosophy to the point where you have that much data and that much certainty of results, we start calling it science. But if you took that single difference away, there is no difference, really. They're doing the same things, and had always been for thousands of years. I mean,
I would add one thing, and that is that it's not just the having of data, because philosophers work with data all the time. I mean, Daniel Dennett is someone who's very active in the philosophy of mind and the cognitive sciences.
Yeah,
and
that's enough. It's enough data. Once you get enough data that you can publish in a cognitive science journal, you're not doing philosophy anymore. You're doing science. And when you don't have that, we just call it philosophy. Now it becomes pseudoscience when you start claiming it's science before you've gotten that much information, right? You start saying you've got a scientific fact, but you don't really. That's pseudoscience at that point. But when you're honestly calling it philosophy, you're not. It's not pseudoscience. You're not claiming to have scientifically proven something. You're claiming you have a good philosophical argument for it. That's not pseudoscience. That's legitimate, and that's what we have to do to fill in the gaps that science can't fill in. Basically.
Right, but there's a tendency that people have, and that is to imagine that if all the philosophers were to just stop their damn philosophizing and would just engage in data collection or something like that, they could just turn these questions into scientific questions.
Yeah, I think is, of course, that's part of what. Right, I mean that's the point, right?
Let's let Ozzy, because I want to hear Ozzy's point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the most important difference here isn't just data. It's that one of the things that goes on in philosophy is you have a question. The question might be ill-posed. It might be ill-formed. There might be assumptions that you're bringing to the question that make the problem unsolvable, right? And part of what goes on in philosophy is trying to represent the problem such that it will admit of solution. And so in my view, things move out of philosophy. They drop out of the province of philosophy and become their own sciences or fall into a chapter of an existing science when we are able to articulate the question and the problem in such a way that it will admit of the techniques of some existing or some nascent, some new science. That, I think, is what happens. Data is critical to that.
Yeah. I agree.
Because sometimes you get data that makes you reconceive of the problem, but it's not as if.
I think you're saying the same thing I am, though, actually, right? So
I am. I was actually.
I think they agree. I think you agree. Yeah.
It's when you can formulate the problem to where you have a database, so you can solve the problem if you have access to the data. When you get those two things, then it becomes what we call science. We start calling it science. We don't have, when it's not that clear. We might have lots of data, by the way, but there's a difference between just having data and having well-generated data, right? Like, so there's a difference between controlled experiments and just walking around looking at stuff. Both are data, but one is much more reliable and can get you much higher levels of certainty, and that's when we get to science, right? Philosophers work with when science can't get at something, or we haven't figured out a way for science to get at something, then we're and you can see the overlap in cosmology, right? So you've got cosmology is still very much a traditional philosophical subject, but cosmological scientists are taking basically philosophical ideas about the cosmos and then seeing how much they can base that on known facts and how much they can actually conceptualize things in terms of like testable things that we could look for. And so, but it's still that most cosmology papers don't prove anything, right? Like most cosmological theories are unproven. They're just theories that have been published, and there's like hundreds of them. But those meet a higher standard than most philosophy. But I think like cosmology in that sense is really on the border. Like it's really hard to tell the difference between philosophy and science at that point. When you move beyond and you start actually getting evidence to prove a theory, like, inflationary Big Bang theory is pretty well proven. It might be overthrown. There's still challenges against it and so on. But that's definitely outside the realm of philosophy. Now we're talking science. That's pretty much scientific fact. And we use that in philosophy of religion to say, well, the Genesis theory of creation can't be true because science, right? It's like, and the same thing with evolution and all of that stuff and so on. But I think we're saying the same thing. That's what I mean. But all of that conceptualization, scientists do this too. Like before stuff even ends up in philosophy, they'll have formulating questions. Like you said, they might even be poorly formed, or they might formulate the questions in ways that make them insoluble. When they crack, actually, then they get a testable theory and go out and do stuff. And do this all the time on subjects that philosophers neglect. They're doing the exact same thing philosophers would do. It's just they're subjects that philosophers aren't spending time on. Like if you're doing theories of bee culture, ethology of bees, there's not a lot of philosophers doing that because it's not top of the list of things that philosophers want to spend time on. But when scientists sit down and want to try and figure out questions in ethology, what they're doing around the table as they talk about this stuff or thinking about this stuff is philosophy. They're doing exactly what philosophers do. They're just doing it about bees. And then most of that stuff might end up nowhere because they can't figure out a way to test this against evidence, or maybe they do, and then it becomes science. So I think that's why I think scientists are doing philosophy way the hell more than they're willing to admit that they're doing. And I think that's bad for them because they need philosophical skills to do it better. But yeah, you had a question, Karis?
There are some who may take some issue with the current conversation. There are some who have mentioned in the side chat, pretty much along the lines that science is more about the methodology and not necessarily the volume and reliability of the available data. How would you respond to those?
Well, those are the same thing, right? Epistemology is philosophers talking about methodology, right? And so scientists have engineered really good methodologies. That's some of the best philosophy we've got in epistemology.
I think
scientific methodology.
I think it was being understood that. I think it was being understood by some that what you were saying was that science basically equated to philosophy plus data, and then as the data and its reliability grew, then it became science. And I think that's where a misunderstanding may have occurred.
Yeah, it's the same for methodologies, right? So, but data can teach us how to improve our methodologies. And we've been doing this when you look at it for 2,000 years, 3,000 years, you see the progress in methodology through philosophy into scientific method. Scientific method is just a diamond-honed epistemology. And being epistemology, it is philosophy, right? And when we get to that point, when we select these tools, and we're now going to call these methodologies scientific methodologies, it's again a database thing. We know that this is the best epistemology because it frickin' works, and we know it frickin' works because of shit tons of data, right? So even the methodologies are proven on a basis of good data, right? And that's just good philosophy. That's just philosophy with data. Yeah, that's my take on it. And people who want to see this, really, you got to look at the historical progress of this. And so my Is Philosophy Stupid talk is probably something you're going to want to go check out if you really want to get where I'm coming from. Oh,
God, yeah, you wrote a paper on it. You just, okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to have a banner that just comes up like he wrote a paper on it, go to his way. It's just, let's say I'm going to hit a button and just...
Nick, you know what your homework is next. You know.
I don't want to know what my homework is. There's always, I'm always in trouble for not doing something. I don't know what it is.
To another list.
Oh God, I got to write another list. Oh dear Lord. Oh dear Lord. All right, so I think I cut somebody off, and I don't know if Dr. Carrier not Dr. Carrier, Ozzy wanted to weigh in or.
Well, I just want to say another thing about this. So the question is, the question whoever it was in the live chat, inside chat, was raising is, it makes it sound like we're saying that science is just philosophy plus data, and it's not. It's as Richard said, you have to have the right epistemology. What makes science science is that it employs a certain kind of epistemology, right? A whole suite of methods that were developed over centuries. There isn't one thing. It isn't just experimentation. It isn't just falsifiability, right? I mean, those are important ingredients in science. They're critical ingredients in science, but they're not the only ingredients in science, right? There are certain metaphysical assumptions that you have to make, right? I mean, and what do we mean by that? Well, we consider certain kinds of things that you assume when you're doing science. You assume that there's a world outside of your mind. You're not dreaming it. You're not deciding it, right? It's there. That's out there, right? Okay. Then there are other minds, and that you can confer with them, right? And that there is uniformity and regularity in the phenomena of nature, so that you can generalize from past experiments to future results that you will find on the basis of that, right? That's why we can use induction, for instance, right? There's a whole suite of assumptions that we make. They're epistemological, they're metaphysical in nature. That's why science is still a philosophy. That's why it can't escape philosophy. It's still a philosophy. It's not just the child of philosophy. It's a species of philosophy. It is a species of naturalistic philosophy. One way to understand science is it is a naturalistic philosophy.
I would call it's the best philosophy we have. Western civilizations, the best philosophy we have just happens to be what we call science. And that's kind of the argument that I make in Is Philosophy Stupid? And how that came about, even semantically, like how we started making the distinction between them as largely a political thing rather than actual substantive difference, other than the ones I'm mentioning.
All right, so
I'm being told to ask Dr. Carrier if they heard through the grapevine they're supposed to ask this, so I'm sure you know the significance of it. Was the Trinity merely politically motivated?
Wow, that's a radical departure from our current line of thinking, but it does fit the philosophy of religion. Here's a good example of a weird philosophy of religion question.
Well, we're
It's totally
winding
political.
down, so I'm trying to kind of
it's
shoehorn.
totally political. The best explanation of this that I've ever read is in Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God. And he has, I can't remember if it's the last chapter or it's near the end of the book. He has a chapter on how the Nicene Creed got formed. And it's just like a few pages, and he just walks you through it. And it's when he puts the data together like that, it's so obvious that it's just a political construct. It had no actual philosophical value. It became a shibboleth. It was just something that you had, even though it made no sense, it was completely contradictory and illogical. It means nothing, but you have to affirm it, that you believe it, in order to signal that you are accepting the current power regime. So if you were to not drink the Kool-Aid, now you're a person who won't drink the Kool-Aid. Now you're a heretic. Now you're not conforming. You're a problem. So it really became a question of how do you distinguish people who are on board with the current political regime and people who are going to be iconoclasts and not go along with it. And so the Nicene Creed became that. And it's still that way. Like Christians talk about how like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons aren't real Christians because of the Trinity. So they're like, they don't drink the Kool-Aid, so they can't be real Christians. That's a political argument, right? I think it's always been that way. And the mechanics of it was that there were certain sects that had controlled certain churches that the Nicene Council decided were going to be the ones with privilege and authority and influence over the government. And then there were other churches with other ideas that weren't popular. They weren't the popular kids. They might have had other views and things they didn't like. But what they did is they looked at the creeds of all the churches that they wanted to unify behind the empire and the churches they wanted to exclude. They looked at their creeds and they invented this Frankenstein's monster of all these patchwork pieces of these contradictory creeds that they approved of, and negatively the creeds that they rejected, and they constructed this elaborate monstrosity called the Nicene Creed that is entirely constructed out of these pieces of these corpses of these creeds of these other religions, just to thread a needle between politically who's in power and who's not, and that's all it was about. And Ehrman has his chapter really illustrates this pretty well, and so I think that if you want to really go into that, you can see how that goes. And that's a good example, by the way, of how history is crucial to informing a lot of aspects of philosophy of religion. It's like you can go and try to philosophize constantly about the Nicene Creed, but if you don't know the historical background of why that Frankenstein's monster was constructed, you'll be missing a lot of the point, and maybe realize that maybe we shouldn't be wasting time talking about the Trinity. It's complete bullshit. It was never a serious philosophical proposal to begin with. But you could have fun with it as a philosopher and say, well, can we make it work? Just for fun. Philosophers can talk about the Trinity because it touches on issues of semantics and metaphysics and ontology and all kinds of so you can do a lot of fun things with it that might be informative, but you would not be taking when you're doing that, I think.
And I do apologize for the jumping topic and lack of any sort of segue. It's just I'm trying to get questions from the chat. And we do have a super chat from Godless Scummer saying, the two universal laws of philosophy. 1, for every philosopher, there's an equal and opposite philosopher. 2, they're both wrong.
And 3, so is this.
Right. Great. That's wonderful.
Carrier's corollary.
Think about that one for a few hours.
Well, and we had what was it? Who somebody asked? I guess he wanted a clarification on a technical term. It was he may have been a troll. It was Christopher Moores. Christopher Myrtle. Christopher the Pesto is real Mouty, I guess is his name, and he wanted to know if he was asking Dr. Carrier if quote shit ton is a technical term.
No, that is definitely a term in philosophy, not science.
And Nick, he wrote a paper on it.
He wrote a paper, exactly. So
I haven't, but I could. I could do a whole semantic
You should.
I actually love the
You should, and give us
semantics
a
of colloquial. The semantics of colloquial language is actually a very fascinating aspect of philosophy of language for me. I love exploring how we use words like shit ton and why everybody who hears me say that knows what I mean, but it has nothing to do with shit or tons, right? So like it's fascinating that how well words can have these meanings. It reminds me of there's a common joke argument, although it actually ends up being a very fascinating philosophical argument. Is a sandwich a taco or vice versa? Do you know this whole debate?
Oh yeah, yes.
Where
Sandwich epistemology. We've seen. I'm
Yes,
curious.
yes.
There are a few discords that do
There's
it.
a
I'm
lot.
half tempted. Yeah.
Yeah. But it illustrates how our brains intuitively understand words, but are subconsciously, but we have a bad time of trying to articulate what it is our brains are doing when they understand words. Because like, why do we distinguish a sandwich and a taco? What is our brain doing? We don't cognitively know that. We'd have to extract it through analysis. And you know, there's the way the rules work out, the way the rules your brain is following don't necessarily line up with the way philosophers think your brain was. But you have to really study it and analyze, you know, the history of linguistics and things like that to really get at why we do these things. And it makes a lot of sense once you get to it. I find it fascinating myself. I don't think it's a silly discussion at all.
And
but
I'm sure we're going to be seeing in chat now whether or not tacos are in fact a type of sandwich. So thank you, Dr. Carey.
Yeah, thank you for that. That will not be on our Discord. Anybody who we're staying out of that nightmare. So a few banned topics.
Wait until you get from sandwich to open-faced sandwich to pizza, and then.
Well, is a hot dog a sandwich? And do you put pineapple on pizza? Don't. Okay, listen. If you want to come back on this show, you're gonna have to clean up your act because I really don't appreciate where you're taking this right now. Okay, this is
all right.
This is. Yeah, I mean,
Welcome in time, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So there's. I would rather have a show on bludgeoning whales with baby sea lions than, frankly, where this is headed, because this is just this. Oh, yeah. Karis Crane, who couldn't be more pleased to be on the show with us today. So, all right. Well, so to wrap this up. So Ozzy, let's start with you. Was there anything in particular that you wanted to? First of all, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that you're doing, and or where people may see you up? I think if people want to see you, they're going to have to go really deep into the woods. But and anything else that you maybe wanted to last things that you would wanted to say didn't, or just how you wanted to wrap it up? Anything else that you wanted to put a pin in?
Sure. Well, if you want to meet me in person, you got to travel far north, and you will have to meet me in the woods. If you're looking to find me online, I have a channel, Ozymandias Ramses II, and I have a Facebook page of the same name. That's it. None of my content is monetized or anything like that. It's not that kind of channel. I take questions from people when I can find time to answer. With respect to sort of last words on this subject, for anybody who's interested in the great debate, especially if you're an atheist, if you're someone who thinks that gods are bullshit, you would be well served by learning some philosophy of religion. Don't be allergic to it because it's got the word religion in it, right? You might come across some apologetics. It's probably a good idea for you to bone up and learn some of what the actual apologetic arguments are instead of assuming that you know that they're all bullshit a priori, which you can't possibly know. And I'd like to, if I can, just shout out a couple of people who are making very, very good content on the philosophy of religion that is very, very easy to understand and accessible. The first is a podcast by a fellow named Emerson Green. It's called Counter Apologetics. He makes these short little nuggets. You can also find him on YouTube, Counter Apologetics with Emerson Green, same name. He has a podcast and a YouTube channel. His content is excellent. And he's an atheist who spends an awful lot of time debunking apologetical arguments. But Joe Schmidt, he has a YouTube channel. He's a YouTuber. He has discussions with all sorts of people. He has debates with people, and he treats these issues quite seriously himself. He is himself an agnostic, philosophical agnostic. And another is by another atheist by the name of Ben Watkins. His podcast and the associated YouTube channel is called Real Atheology. He and his co-hosts and others on the show do some pretty deep dives into the philosophy of religion, but they take care to explain as they go, so you won't just be swimming in jargon. So I would recommend those three sources to you: Counter Apologetics with Emerson Green, Majesty of Reason on YouTube, and Real Atheology. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to be having you on. I could think of at least 2 or 3 times coming up in the future. We're going to continue this series on Introduction to Philosophy, and we're going to do What is an Argument, which we actually haven't done. That's one that might usually come before what is it? Hume's problem of induction, but we ended up, it was still, I think we did a great job with that. I enjoyed that. That was a spectacular show. And then we're also going to have you on for the ontology of gender, which is going to be nice and controversy free, I am sure. I think I'm gonna actually want to go back to pineapples on pizza. So I will greatly prefer that one, I think, too. But I think that's gonna I think we have a good foil for you, and I think that's gonna be a good show. So thank you very much, Ozzy, for joining us. Dr. Carrier. I'm sorry, what Charles is, or Charles, I can't believe I fell nothing. I didn't actually do that. That was a troll. Yes. So,
just get us out of here.
Okay. Dr. Carrier, so now that you don't ever want to show your face again because you've been on In Time for like the 4th or 5th time, and so what anything?
I'm always happy to be on. So ask me anytime.
It's a delight. What was there anything you wanted to sort of put a pin in, and why don't you remind us about your book? We do have your Amazon, I think, already in the description, and we'll be dropping that in the live chat shortly. But anything else you want to put a pin in, and just remind us of what your work is and where people can find you? There is some serious interest in finding you on our live chat, so why don't you let people know?
All right. Well, my new book that's just come out, or very nearly, is Jesus from Outer Space, which is on the historicity question. Books that are relevant to what we talked about today are my first book, Sense and Goodness Without God, which is on a complete worldview, metaphysical naturalism. And then my books on ancient science, which is my Columbia University dissertation subject. Plus lots more, lots of books. But I teach online courses. I do a 1-month online course. It's all bulletin board type. It's Google Group based, study at your own pace kind of thing. And where you can ask me all the questions you have on the subject that's being taught. And then I have recommended readings, and I have challenge questions, and I'll review and discuss your answers to those questions and things like that, and basically teach various subjects. And one of them is ancient science, which I'm going to start. I haven't announced it yet, but within hours of now, my ancient science course will be announced. Every month I teach, now it'll be about 7 or 8 different courses. I'm adding one every month. So in any coming month, you can take a course with me on various subjects in history and philosophy. I have, for example, science and philosophy of free will I do a course on. I do the science and philosophy of moral reasoning. So yeah, the word science is in there for a reason. So I do a lot of things like that. So, and I've got, historicity of Jesus course, historical methods course, critical thinking, etc. So check all of that out. If I love getting the opportunity to convey that stuff and make a living teaching as an independent scholar. So all of that and all these other things, my blog, you can find my Patreon, my Facebook, my Twitter feed, and all that stuff. All of that is warehoused at richardcarrier.info. So just Richard Carrier, all one word, .info. That's the clearinghouse of all things Richard Carrier. And you can just explore there, and there's tons to look at.
And actually, since I've got you on this, was because Christopher Mauti was actually the guy's name. He's still a troll, but I'll give his real name. He's got an issue with pesto. He really I don't know what it is with him and pesto, but nonetheless, he's a friend of mine, good friend of the show. He's been a guest host a couple of times. He denies it, but we have the video evidence of it, and so he's interested in language. I think he wanted to talk to you. You may not know this actually, but when I was in high school, my father practiced law in 6 languages, and I picked up languages prodigiously. I sort of picked that up from
Wow.
him. It's been a while since I studied a language, but by the time I graduated high school, I spoke Spanish, French, Russian, and a little Japanese. So, and I, BA in philosophy. So, you, Maudy, and I need to get together and have. I think that would be a delightful conversation.
Yeah.
So I'll hook you up because I can reach you. Karis, was there anything else that you wanted to? And then no, she wants to get off. As she's just it's like, can we please just turn the camera off?
I'm not rushing out. It's wonderful having you here. It's an honor as always.
So I'd like to remind everybody we're going to be in the Discord afterwards. Dr. Carey is going to be in there. I think Ozzy's going to try to join us if he can. I will join in a couple of minutes. Also, if you've gotten to this point in the show and if you've been enjoying it, please like and subscribe. It is a great way to help the channel. It doesn't cost anything. Just hit the thumbs up, like the show, and subscribe. If you didn't like the content, you know what? We'll take the thumbs down. You can go to Ozymandias Ramses II. That's our sister channel, and you can just give that a thumbs down. That's not a problem. I don't mind. We will take the hit on that. But at any rate, maybe he didn't hear that. It's almost not worth it if he didn't hear it. It's probably still worth it, but it just takes a lot of the joy out of that kind of thing. So we have a Patreon. You can join us there. You can subscribe to the show. We hope you had a good time. Thank you both very much for coming. It was a genuine pleasure. Thank you, Karis, for coming and being a delightful co-host. And we will see you all. Actually, we may have a show on Friday. We'll discuss it all later. Thank you all for coming.